Hello again, all you Star Wars Unlimited people. Hope you've been enjoying your Jump to Lightspeed pre-releases. I'd like to have a chat today about a couple of cards that have been part of the online discourse of Star Wars Unlimited due to a potential spike in power level. We're talking about a couple of commons from Spark of Rebellion, no less. As we move into the Jump to Lightspeed meta, there's been some concern specifically around the card Confiscate, but also to a lesser extent disabling Fangfighter. I don't want to have a chat about these on camera because I find this conversation very, very interesting because I actually don't know where I fall on this in terms of my own concern of what these cards do to the meta. There's a few unprecedented factors going on when we assess what these are doing to some of the new leaders. Before we get into it, let's actually just contextualize everything that's going on here. So in Jump to Lightspeed, we have a new mechanic called piloting. Some of these non-leader units are able to be deployed onto one of your vehicles as an upgrade, or they can be deployed as a ground unit. There's a bit of modality to these cards. While these are on vehicles, these count as upgrades. So of course, cards like Confiscate, disabling Fangfighters, or anything else that can just wholesale defeat upgrades do now affect these cards, because as they are on a vehicle, the game state tracks them as an upgrade. Now, if this were the only factor moving into this meta, as in there's now a whole bunch more upgrades that Confiscate has targets for, I wouldn't be too concerned. But what is concerning is how it affects some of the leaders in Jump to Lightspeed. Some of these can be deployed as an upgrade onto your vehicles, just as they can be deployed as a ground unit. So now we're currently in a situation where some arguably very efficient cards can now just remove the effects that your leader has. It's not the leader unit per se, it's the leader when it's played as an upgrade. And I think this is actually a very interesting conversation in terms of whether this is okay, whether this is deemed too powerful. And I think the interesting factor going on here is not so much the conversation around power level, but the conversation around opportunity cost. Because when we're talking about power level, Confiscate could already hit a lot of very relevant targets within the meta. You could hit the Darksaber, you could hit General's Blade, it could hit full-on lightsabers, all that kind of stuff. A very good trade in your resources and cards against your opponent's resources and cards. It's a one-for-one trading up in resources every time. And for that reason, Confiscate was already played in a lot of competitive deck sideboards. It's almost never played in the main board, although that may change for the reasons we're about to discuss. But the cool thing about Confiscate is it has no aspect. It can be played in any deck. It's a nice little safety valve against decks playing upgrades. And at the end of the day, being able to remove upgrades isn't a huge detriment to your opponent necessarily. It's not removing the unit it's on. There are already cards that can do that. But Confiscate only costs one. That's kind of the trade-off going on here. For these reasons, I've never really had a concern with this card per se. It does constantly trade up whenever it's used in-game, but there are constantly situations where you can't use it because your opponent doesn't have a relevant upgrade for you to fight, so you end up resourcing it. It's almost never played in main decks because it's not relevant enough of the time to play main deck. The situation now, though, is we've suddenly greatly lowered the opportunity cost of playing this and disabled Fangfighter. The reason I say that is it is a huge advantage being able to play a hate piece, potentially main deck, but in the sideboard at all, especially when it's able to answer leaders, whether, these leaders become meta relevant or not. But there's a few factors that sort of, in my mind, edge this out over other common hate pieces in the game. Last set, for example, we had Clear the Field, and this was a card that I saw a lot of people get really concerned about because of how efficiently it answers tokens. Basically, if you use this to remove one of your opponent's tokens, you remove all of that token. So if they've got a bunch of clone troopers or battle droids, or in the new meta, I guess X-Wing or TIE fighters, it's pretty efficient. However, this card is also quite aspect intensive. It is yellow and white. And in terms of the opportunity cost of playing this, it's a just mediocre piece of removal in most scenarios when you don't have a bunch of tokens to deal with. In a lot of situations, it's quite bad playing this card over Spare the Target or Waylay or something like that, where you can actually answer haymakers, not just units that cost a very tiny little amount. And as a result, you only really want to play this in the sideboard, and only really when your deck is very soft to token strategies, or when token strategies actually become meta relevant. All this factors up to a card that has a very high opportunity cost to play. Even as a one-off slot in your sideboard of 10 cards, those slots really do matter, even if they're not in your main deck. But turning our attention back to a card like Confiscate, if it has a lot of decent targets, and if the cost is so low and the aspect intensity just is not there, you suddenly have an extremely low opportunity cost, to the point where I think there's a good chance that the jump to lightspeed meta may basically make it no opportunity cost at all, because there's just always going to be some kind of relevant target. The fact of the matter is, answering leaders does usually come with a pretty severe cost in this game. If you have a look at cards like Vanquish and Fallen Rival, you can see there's a literal tax on targeting leaders in this game. Indeed, most removal pieces do sort of scale up in cost when it comes to, you know, the diversity of what they can target, whether or not they can target leaders, etc. And when you have a card that only costs 1 with no aspect that can just hit a leader upgrade, yeah, it doesn't really feel like there's any cost attached to that whatsoever. Now, the flip side of that is, of course, while leaders are upgrades, they're not really a leader unit per se. You're not removing the unit they're on, so I understand the argument around that. There's just a few factors here which to me makes Confiscate a little bit too easy to slot in. And the fact of the matter is, the floor on this card, the power level floor, when we're talking about situations it can be played in, you draw it and what does the board state look like and how relevant is Confiscate to that? The reality is that there may be situations where it just removes a shield token from one of your opponent's units. The fact of the matter is, there are already a decent number of upgrades in the game that decks just incidentally play, whether or not those are tokens or those are like DL44 blasters. And the fact that we're injecting so many more relevant targets into the game in the form of unit pilots, and on top of that giving this card the absolutely insane ceiling of being able to hit leader upgrades as well, to me just makes this card feel so relevant. Star Wars Unlimited is already a game where you have a lot of card selection. In a game like Magic the Gathering, once per turn you draw 1 card. Yes, there are other cards that can draw cards, but the same is true of Star Wars Unlimited and other TCGs. In Star Wars, you draw 2 cards and resource 1 of them. So you get the same amount of card advantage, but you also get more card selection. The fact of the matter is, the floor on this card isn't that low anymore, and being able to resource it as well says to me this might just become a main deckable card, which on a sideboard card, a card that's clearly designed to be a sideboard card anyway, that has this insane power level, that's why I'm concerned here. It's not so much that power level per se. That power level already existed in the game. It's the opportunity cost has just become basically non-existent. That's my main concern. And most importantly, that is unprecedented. We can talk all day about cards and compare them to, you know, elements we already have in the game, etc. But in terms of a sideboard card that has such an insane power level, that answers things so efficiently, that now has such a low opportunity cost, I don't think we've really had this kind of element in the game before, and that's why I'm unsure about this. Now, one thing I will say in terms of the argument against everything I've just said, the idea that Confiscate might not be such an impressive force, if pilot leaders do become super relevant, say your Von Regs or your Kazuda Xionas and that kind of stuff, 2 cards that I think are really worth looking at in the early meta in terms of pilot leaders. Thanks to Planning Phase Syndicate for calling out Kaz. After some playtesting, I think I have to agree this card does look quite dope. The reason that Confiscate might be not such an impressive force is, at the end of the day, all of these leaders we're talking about can be deployed as a ground unit. And players that are good at reading what their opponent's trying to do, players that are good at reading the situation, assessing the boards, seeing how your opponent is using resources, are they holding up that one resource to fire off the Confiscate? You can just deploy Major Von Reg or Kaz or Boba Fett or whatever pilot leader you have as a ground unit and completely nullify the card in their hand, which is a pretty nice counterplay. Now, none of these leaders feel great to deploy as a ground unit, but the modality is important, and at the end of the day, do you really want to just run this into a Confiscate? I think if I had a Vader, yeah, sure, I don't want to deploy my 6-drop leader as a vanilla 5/6 with no abilities. kind of feels bad. At the same time, I don't want them to be just answered by a hyper-efficient one-resource event. And as additional upside to doing this play, I have made the card in my opponent's hand dead, which can be very potent. Of course, if your opponent doesn't have the Confiscate and they're just bluffing that they do, that is a very suboptimal way of playing. So even just the threat of Confiscate might be a very powerful thing. There's a few things to think about here. I think at the end of the day, I'm not trying to like do some kind of crazy hot take. I'm not trying to say, oh, the game's ruined because of this one card. I think what I'm trying to point out here, above everything else, is this is kind of unprecedented. So if anyone's saying they know this is clearly broken or it's clearly fine, I don't think that is a very honest way to approach this kind of thing. I think it is very reasonable to be concerned about this because of that low opportunity cost. And hey, if it turns out to be busted, maybe it'll just get banned in Premier Play and FFG can learn something about how they level their cards. Maybe like, oh, next time it can be a 2-resource. Maybe next time it can have an aspect like, I can see this being like a red or green card. But ultimately, this is a very new card game and these things are bound to happen. We're at the point where there's almost, 1,000 unique cards in the game. Yeah, balancing things, especially across sets, isn't always going to be the easiest thing. So, might just be a learning curve. Might not be worth worrying about at all. We will see. Answers in the comments. What do you think about this? Do you feel like Confiscate's just a horrible oppressive force or everyone's just freaking out for no reason? Love to hear your thoughts. Tell me how your pre-releases are going. What decks are you brewing? And I'll catch you all in the next video.